if it has reduced its importance in the overall pie or its share of the overall pie, when it does kick in, there's less silver available for investment demand. And therefore, it could leverage up its effect. In other words, the less silver available, if people, pile into buying silver for investment purposes and there's less available, they're going to have to bid it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we could just really see it explode. And again, I just think that, it has a place in everyone's portfolio. It's a question of proportion.
Welcome to Economy Express, your go-to destination for all things economics and finance. Whether you're an experienced investor, an inquisitive student, or just someone who wants to stay ahead in today's ever-changing economic landscape, you've come to the right place. Now, let's get into the details of our news.
In a groundbreaking forecast, renowned analyst Peter Krauth predicts a massive surge in silver prices, potentially skyrocketing to $1,250. With the Federal Reserve expected to make at least one, possibly two rate cuts before the next election, Krauth suggests that these actions could set the stage for explosive growth in silver. Historically, every time the Fed has engaged in rate-cutting cycles, silver has seen remarkable gains, averaging over 400% in returns. This trend signals a golden, or rather silver, opportunity for investors. Silver stocks, which often leverage the gains of silver itself, could offer even more substantial returns, possibly doubling or tripling investments. Despite increasing industrial demand, silver retains its monetary value, often following the trend set by gold. Currently, approximately 60% of silver's usage is industrial, with the remaining 40% driven by monetary purposes. This dual role enhances its appeal as a versatile investment. The demand for silver in the solar industry is booming, with usage soaring from 60 million ounces a decade ago to an anticipated 230 million ounces this year. As the industry shifts to more efficient technologies like TOPCon and HJT, which require significantly more silver, the demand is set to increase even further. Notably, silver used in solar panels is not recoverable, adding to its scarcity and potential price surge. Geopolitical shifts are also at play. As the United States weaponizes the dollar, freezing Russian assets and supporting Ukraine, other countries are increasingly
possibly two cuts before the election, depending on the timings of Fed meetings and so on. So I'm going to say I think odds are good for at least one. The Fed wants to probably look like it's doing what it can to quote unquote stay out of the way of an election and not sort
and
of
be apolitical, yeah.
Right, and not be overly restrictive or overly accommodating. So at least a trend towards, kind of pulling things back in terms of rates. But I do think that we're going to get, as you said, I've pointed out before, and as you've written about, how if you look at the last three times that the Fed engaged in rate cutting cycles. Silver did extremely well, and it followed gold. And I'm going to get back to a point that you mentioned earlier, but silver returned over 400% on average if you look at the last three rate cutting cycles. That is just fantastic, phenomenal. And I think that people need to prepare for that. And yes, it'll come with some volatility. But if silver can do that, they need to consider what silver stocks can do, because they're going to leverage that probably at least 2 to 1. And probably well beyond it. So the opportunity is going to present itself. It's coming. I think we need to gear up for it. People need to do some research and position themselves, and also understand themselves in terms of knowing themselves, in terms of their risk tolerance. But it's definitely something that they're going to want to take advantage of. In terms of what you said earlier about how it's some are saying that it's losing its monetary component. So I like what you pointed out, the fact that, it having followed gold and really shot up in the first half of this year, to me, suggests that it maintains that monetary aspect. I think it's not so much that it's losing it. I think it's that the industrial component of silver is growing versus, in other words, the monetary aspect is probably more or less staying what it has been for decades. I think it's the industrial component that's sort of creeping up on it and taking some of the overall share of the pie.
Yeah, proportionally bigger. Yeah.
Exactly. So if you look at the numbers, I think that industrially we're looking at probably around 60% now of silver going to industrial uses and 40 to some kind of monetary demand. And I personally combine, the buying of investment silver through bars and coins, along with jewelry and silverware, and I consider those three to be overall loosely investment demand. So what I would say is anyone who says, well, okay, so investment demand is now not as important, I would actually flip the table on that and say, if it has reduced its importance in the overall pie or its share of the overall pie, when it does kick in, there's less silver available for investment demand, and therefore it could leverage up its effect. In other words, the less silver available, if people pile into buying silver for investment purposes and there's less available, they're going to have to bid it up.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So we could just really see it explode. And again, I just think that it has a place in everyone's portfolio. It's a question of proportion. If anyone who has read my book knows that the subtitle is crush inflation and profit as the dollar dies. And so certainly that's my outlook. And so if in the near term, I would say that the bigger catalyst is going to be rate cuts. And I think that this sort of vacillating that we've seen in the dollar index in the last few months has been the dollar index moving with expectations of rate cuts. We have seen it kind of back off a little bit in the last week or two. And I think that that's because we're seeing unemployment rise, for example. We're seeing the approaching election. We're seeing the Fed starting to sound, even if it's just slightly more dovish. And so near term, I think that, yes, we're going to start to see the dollar and the dollar index start to weaken. It's not going to be a crash, I don't think necessarily. And then longer term, certainly, and as I've discussed in the book, I think that, and as you mentioned rightly so earlier, that this is a longer term play. And clearly with the US having used the dollar as, weaponized the dollar really by freezing Russian assets, and now actually looking at using Russian assets to support Ukraine, the rest of the world is looking at this. Sovereign investors, sovereign wealth funds, central banks, they're looking at this and saying, I don't want to get caught like that. What options do I have? And the dollar as the world's reserve currency, even if it's a de facto world reserve currency, has a lot of people on edge, and they're feeling that I maybe own too many dollars and there are other options for me. And maybe I should go for the ultimate safe haven, and that's gold and silver, precious metals. So I think longer term we are, moving towards that. You mentioned petrodollar. You've got Saudi Arabia now that has entered as a member of the BRICS nations, and so it's certainly. My understanding is that it's not sort of a done deal in terms of de-dollarizing, but they're absolutely looking at accepting other currencies rather than the dollar for their oil. They themselves are looking to move away from oil for their own economy and to move towards renewable energies and to lower their carbon footprint. And then you've got other countries like China, Russia, Iran. They're all looking to trade with each other in other currencies other than the dollar. They just don't want to be boxed into being stuck with trading in dollars and perhaps having too many dollars and being frozen out of being able to trade with others.
Wary of holding too many dollars. Sovereign investors and central banks are exploring alternatives like gold and silver, driven by the inclusion of Saudi Arabia in the BRICS nations and their exploration of other currencies for oil trade. With the limited supply of silver for investment purposes and the increasing demand, prices could soar as investors scramble to secure their holdings. Krauth advises investors to conduct thorough research and strategically position themselves to capitalize on these unprecedented opportunities. As the dollar index fluctuates with the expectations of rate cuts and the Federal Reserve adopts a dovish stance, the dollar may weaken further. This weakening dollar could boost the demand for precious metals, offering a hedge against inflation and currency devaluation. In the longer term, the move away from dollar dominance is evident.
Sort of mainstream kinds of banks put out this kind of research and these kinds of predictions, and I think it's very telling that when you see these kinds of institutions starting to recognize and realize and being willing to come out and say these kinds of things in a very public way, that it's going to become undeniable. In fact, in my opinion, when you see that kind of action. If you look at, say, 10 years ago, about 60 million ounces went to solar. If you look at just 4 years ago, 90 million ounces of silver annually went to solar. Last year it was 193 million ounces. This year it's forecast at 230 million ounces. So it's essentially, in the last, say, 3 or 4 years, it's up 2.5 times the amount of silver that's gone to solar. So it's absolutely exploded. There was a forecast that the growth of solar would be somewhere around, I think it was around 20% or so year over year from 2022 to 2023. It turns out that it was 64% growth of the amount of silver that went to solar. And so the Silver Institute is forecasting that we're going to see a 20% growth again this year. And so, what some people are saying is that, you've seen this thing called thrifting, where naturally the manufacturers of solar panels will look for ways to cut costs, and they'll use in one instance at least they'll look to use less silver. It's a considerable portion of the cost to manufacture a panel, and what we've seen is that the amount of silver in each panel has actually plateaued. It's been dropping for 10 years and it's sort of flatlining now. I think we're on the verge of seeing that start to spike up, and the reason for it is, we've talked about this before, but we're shifting really from what we call the standard or the incumbent technologies, which is PERC, exactly, and we're shifting to TOPCon and HJT. Now, TOPCon takes up to 50% more silver per solar panel. HJT takes up to 150% more silver per panel. So we are not only growing the amount of solar panels that we're producing, but we're also shifting to technologies that require more silver per panel. So it's almost like you've got this exponential growth in silver demand going to solar. And so even if you had solar production flatline for whatever reason, economic downturn, a move away temporarily from this green transition, whatever it might be, you still have this shift towards higher efficiency in solar panels. And so that, I believe, if nothing else, will help to maintain a growth in the demand of silver for solar panels, even if the rate slows somewhat. So silver that goes into solar panels for now is not recuperable. It may be one day, but for all intents and purposes, it's not recuperable. So you don't see that silver ever again. It just ends up ultimately maybe 20, 25 years from now in some waste dump or something. So that's silver that you just don't have access to anymore, and that takes away from silver for other purposes, including investment. And so it's just very bullish for not only the industrial side, but the investment side as well.
Countries like China, Russia, and Iran are seeking to trade in other currencies, further bolstering the case for precious metals as a safe haven. Investors are urged to prepare now for the upcoming market conditions driven by Federal Reserve actions and global economic shifts. The potential rewards of investing in silver and silver stocks are substantial, making it a compelling addition to any investment portfolio. Stay tuned for more updates as we continue to track this exciting development in the silver market.